My name is Madeline Pierce, but everyone calls me Maddie. At 35, I've spent the last decade climbing the corporate ladder at Crestfall Innovations, a tech company nestled in the heart of Portland, Oregon. As Deputy General Counsel and Head of Compliance, I've seen this place transform from a scrappy startup into a billion-dollar enterprise. I've also seen enough corporate dirty laundry to stock a small laundromat. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Conference Room A as I adjusted my black blazer and checked my watch. 3 minutes until the all-hands meeting that would change everything. The entire company had been summoned to witness what our new CEO, Austin Cade, called his vision for revolutionary transformation. I'd been through enough corporate restructures to know that phrase was executive speak for heads will roll. Austin had been hired 6 months ago by the board of directors, plucked from a failing Silicon Valley startup where he'd apparently performed miracles. His resume read like a TED Talk transcript: disruptive innovation, paradigm shifts, synergistic optimization. The man spoke in buzzwords the way others breathed oxygen. He wore neon-colored suits that cost more than most people's rent and paired them with sneakers that looked like they belonged in a modern art museum. The conference room filled with nervous chatter as employees filed in. I watched faces I'd worked alongside for years, people who'd built this company from the ground up, now sitting with the tense posture of defendants awaiting verdict. Austin's restructuring had already begun in whispers and closed-door meetings. Budgets had been slashed, projects cancelled, and long-time employees had started receiving mysterious calendar invitations for transition discussions. Austin strode on to the small stage at the front of the room like a conquering general. His smile was all teeth and no warmth, the kind of expression that made you check your wallet afterward. He wore an electric blue suit that seemed to pulse under the fluorescent lights, and his platinum hair was styled in a way that suggested he'd spent more time in front of a mirror than preparing for this presentation. "Good morning, Crestfall family," he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a motivational speaker. "Today marks the beginning of our metamorphosis from a legacy company trapped in yesterday's thinking to a forward-thinking powerhouse ready to dominate tomorrow's markets." The applause was polite but scattered. Austin's smile never wavered. "A change is never easy," he continued, pacing across the stage with theatrical precision. "But change is also never optional. The old guard, the dinosaurs, the fossil fuel mentality that's been holding us back, that ends today." His eyes swept across the room and landed on me. The smile turned predatory. "Some of you have been here since the Stone Age of this company. You've built impressive careers maintaining the status quo, creating bureaucratic barriers, and ensuring that innovation moves at the speed of molasses through our compliance departments." The room fell silent. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I kept my expression neutral, though something cold settled in my stomach. "But here's the thing about fossils," Austin said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "They belong in museums, not in boardrooms. They're artifacts of a time when we thought paperwork was more important than progress, when we believed that saying no was easier than finding a way to say yes." He paused, letting his words sink in. The applause that followed was louder this time, driven more by fear than enthusiasm. People clapped because they were afraid not to, afraid that silence might mark them as fossils too. I didn't clap. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching Austin's performance with the detached interest of a chess player studying an opponent's opening gambit. He was good. I'd give him that. He knew how to work a room, how to make people believe that destruction was actually construction, that humiliation was motivation. "Now," Austin continued, his voice rising again, "I want to talk about our legal and compliance departments. These are the departments that have been saying we can't instead of how can we. They're the departments that have been building walls instead of bridges, creating obstacles instead of opportunities. He gestured toward my section of the room, and I felt every eye in the building turn toward me. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity. A few showed the kind of cruel anticipation that comes from watching someone else's downfall. "It's time to retire the old playbook," Austin announced. "It's time to embrace a new paradigm where compliance supports innovation instead of strangling it, where legal counsel enables growth instead of preventing it, where we move from a culture of no to a culture of yes, and here's how." The applause was thunderous now. Austin basked in it, spreading his arms wide, like a conductor directing an orchestra. When the noise finally died down, he delivered his closing statement with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Ladies and gentlemen, the fossil age at Crestfall Innovations is officially over. Welcome to the future." I walked out of that meeting with my head held high and my mind already calculating angles. I'd been in corporate America long enough to recognize a declaration of war when I heard one. Austin Cade had just painted a target on my back in front of 300 witnesses, and he'd done it with such theatrical flair that people would remember it for years. The following weeks confirmed my suspicions. My calendar began mysteriously emptying itself. Meetings I'd been included in for years suddenly proceeded without me. My access to certain systems was quietly restricted, always with some technical explanation that didn't quite add up. I went from being in the center of major decisions to being CC'd on emails as an afterthought. The isolation was methodical and professional. Austin was too smart to fire me outright. That would risk a wrongful termination lawsuit. Instead, he was executing a slow strangulation, cutting off my influence and authority until I became irrelevant enough to dismiss without consequence. But Austin had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that years of corporate compliance work had made me soft, that I'd roll over and accept my fate like a good little fossil. He didn't understand that surviving in legal and compliance for a decade had taught me skills that went far beyond contract negotiation and regulatory interpretation. I'd learned how to read between the lines, how to spot discrepancies that others missed, how to follow paper trails that led to uncomfortable truths. Most importantly, I'd learned how to be patient, how to build a case piece by piece until it became unassailable. While Austin played his games of corporate theater, I began constructing what I privately called the lockbox file. Every questionable decision, every bypassed protocol, every financial irregularity that had emerged since his arrival went into my digital vault. I worked after hours, using my own devices, creating backups on servers that existed outside Crestfall's network. The pattern that emerged was staggering. Austin hadn't just been cutting compliance corners, he'd been building a highway through them. Financial reports had been altered to show better performance metrics. Audit recommendations had been buried or ignored entirely. Investment partnerships had been formed with entities that didn't pass basic due diligence checks. But the real revelation came from an unexpected source. Jonah Myers, the quiet assistant to board member Patricia Holbrook, approached me one evening as I was leaving the office. He was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who'd worked for the company longer than I had, invisible to most executives, but trusted with access to board-level documents. "Ms. Pierce," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "I think there's something you should see." He handed me a flash drive. "Mrs. Holbrook doesn't know I'm giving you this, but she's been expressing concerns about some of the financial reports Mr. Cade has been presenting to the board. She asked me to do some digging into the background documentation." I studied his face carefully. "What kind of concerns?" "Revenue projections that don't match the underlying data. Partnership agreements that seem designed to obscure rather than clarify. Investment structures that..." He paused, searching for the right words. Let's just say they raise questions about who's really benefiting from these deals. The flash drive contained a treasure trove of internal documents that had been sanitized before reaching Austin's presentations. The real numbers painted a picture of a company being systematically hollowed out, its assets being redirected through a maze of shell companies and offshore partnerships. My second unexpected ally came from outside the company. Natalie Chen, my former law school roommate, had spent 5 years as an investigator with the Securities and Exchange Commission before moving to private practice. We'd kept in touch over the years, meeting for coffee whenever she was in Portland on business. "This is explosive," she said, after reviewing a sample of what I'd uncovered. We were sitting in a quiet corner of Powell's Books, surrounded by the comforting smell of old paper and fresh coffee. "If even half of this is accurate, you're looking at securities fraud, tax evasion, and possibly money laundering." "How bulletproof is it legally?" I asked. She flipped through the documents again, her expression growing more serious. "With proper authentication and chain of custody documentation, this could trigger a federal investigation. The question is whether you're prepared for the consequences of going public with this." I thought about Austin's theatrical performance, about the way he'd humiliated me in front of the entire company, about the systematic dismantling of everything I'd worked to build. What kind of consequences? Criminal investigations don't just target the primary suspects. They examine everyone who might have known about the illegal activity. Your fingerprints are all over this company's legal decisions for the past decade. You'd better be absolutely certain that everything you've done can withstand that level of scrutiny. The weight of her words settled over me like a heavy blanket, but I'd been preparing for this possibility since the day I'd started building my case. Every decision I'd made, every document I'd signed, every recommendation I'd given had been by the book. I'd covered my tracks not because I was planning something illegal, but because I was planning something that would invite intense legal scrutiny. My third ally was perhaps the most unexpected. Marcus Webb was a financial journalist for the Portland Business Journal who'd been covering Crestfall's growth story for years. We'd crossed paths at industry events, and I'd always found him to be thorough and fair in his reporting. 2 years ago, I'd helped him navigate a legal challenge when his paper had been threatened with a defamation lawsuit over a story about city council corruption. It wasn't technically part of my job, but I'd provided some informal guidance that had helped them avoid a costly legal battle. "I owe you one," he'd said at the time. "If you ever need a favor, just ask." Now I was calling in that favor. "I need you to understand something," I told him during our carefully arranged meeting at a restaurant in the Pearl District. "I'm not looking for a hit piece or a revenge story. I'm looking for a journalist who can properly investigate and report on financial irregularities at a major Portland company." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me with the calculating gaze of a reporter who'd heard this pitch before. "What kind of irregularities?" I slid a folder across the table. "The kind that federal prosecutors find interesting." He opened the folder and his eyebrows rose steadily as he scanned the contents. "Jesus, Maddie, this is career-ending stuff. For him, I mean. But also potentially for you if you're wrong." "I'm not wrong," I said quietly, "and I have the documentation to prove it." The final piece of my strategy required the most delicate timing. Austin had announced another company-wide meeting for the following Friday, billing it as a transformation celebration to showcase the progress made during his first year as CEO. The invitation had been sent to investors, board members, and media representatives. It was clearly designed to be his coronation, his moment of complete triumph. I spent the week before the meeting making final preparations. The lockbox file was complete, organized into categories that would make sense to investigators, journalists, and prosecutors. I'd created multiple backup copies stored on servers in different states, with instructions for automatic distribution if anything happened to me. The documentation was devastating. Austin's revolutionary transformation had been built on a foundation of financial fraud, regulatory violations, and shareholder deception. The shell companies, the offshore partnerships, the manipulated financial reports, everything was documented with the kind of meticulous detail that would make federal prosecutors salivate. But the timing had to be perfect. Too early, and Austin would have time to spin the narrative or destroy evidence. Too late, and he might escape with the stolen assets before the authorities could act. I settled on a solution that felt poetic in its simplicity. A scheduled email system that would trigger automatically during Austin's presentation. While he was on stage celebrating his success, the evidence of his crimes would be winging its way to every relevant authority, investor, and media outlet simultaneously. The email recipients included the SEC, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, the Oregon Department of Justice, every member of Crestfall's board of directors, major investors, and a carefully selected group of financial journalists. The subject line was simple: Crestfall Innovations, Financial Fraud and Securities Violations, Documented Evidence Attached. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Portland famous. I dressed carefully for what I knew would be my final day at Crestfall, choosing a charcoal grey suit that projected confidence without ostentation. I wanted to look professional, composed, unruffled by whatever theatrical performance Austin had planned. The main auditorium had been transformed for the occasion. Professional lighting equipment cast dramatic shadows across the stage, and a massive screen displayed the Crestfall logo alongside Austin's personal motto: Innovation through elimination. The irony wasn't lost on me. The audience was larger than usual, including faces I didn't recognize: investors, journalists, and industry analysts who'd been invited to witness Austin's moment of triumph. I took a seat in the back row, close to the exit, and checked my phone one final time. The scheduled email was set to trigger at 2:15 p.m., precisely 15 minutes after Austin's presentation was scheduled to begin. Austin appeared on stage to thunderous applause, resplendent in a suit that seemed to shift between purple and gold depending on the lighting. He spread his arms wide, basking in the adoration of an audience that had no idea what was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily through the auditorium's sound system, "1 year ago I stood before you and promised a revolution. I promised to eliminate the barriers that were holding this company back, to clear away the deadwood that was preventing us from reaching our full potential." The applause was enthusiastic. Austin paused, scanning the audience with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he'd already won. "Today, I'm here to tell you that the revolution is complete. We have successfully eliminated the fossil fuel mentality that was dragging us down. We have streamlined our operations, optimized our performance metrics, and positioned ourselves for explosive growth in the coming decade." He clicked a remote, and the massive screen behind him filled with charts and graphs, showing impressive growth statistics. Revenue up 30%. Operational efficiency improved by 40%. Market share expanding across all sectors. "But more importantly," Austin continued, his voice dropping to that conspiratorial whisper that had become his trademark, "we've eliminated the culture of no that was strangling our innovation. We've replaced the bureaucratic obstacles with streamlined processes. We've traded the fossil fuel mentality for rocket fuel acceleration." I checked my phone. 2:12 p.m. 3 minutes. "Now, I want to take a moment to address the resistance we encountered during this transformation," Austin said, his tone becoming more serious. "Change is never easy, and not everyone was ready to embrace the future. Some people were so invested in the old way of doing things that they couldn't see the opportunities that lay ahead." He paused, his eyes scanning the audience until they found me in the back row. The smile that crossed his face was pure predator. We had some fossils in our legal and compliance departments who thought their job was to prevent progress rather than enable it. People who believed that saying no was easier than finding creative solutions. People who were so risk-averse that they couldn't see the forest for the trees. A few people in the audience turned to look at me. I sat perfectly still, my expression neutral, my hands folded in my lap. 2:14 p.m. "But here's the beautiful thing about fossils," Austin continued, his voice rising with theatrical enthusiasm. "Once you dig them up and put them in a museum, they stop getting in the way of progress. They become artifacts, curiosities, reminders of a time when we thought small instead of thinking big." The audience laughed. Some of the laughter was nervous, but most of it was genuine. Austin had turned my professional destruction into entertainment. So today, I'm proud to announce that we've completed the final phase of our transformation. We've officially transitioned from a culture of compliance to a culture of performance, from a culture of obstacles to a culture of opportunities, from a culture of fossils to a culture of the future. 2:15 p.m. Somewhere in the building, servers were humming to life. Email systems were processing attachments. Digital packets of information were beginning their journey across the internet to destinations that would change everything Austin thought he knew about power and control. Austin raised his arms in triumph and the audience erupted in applause. He was still basking in the adulation when the first phone started buzzing. It began slowly. A few people in the front row discreetly checking their devices. Then more phones lighting up across the auditorium. The applause began to falter as people realized something was happening. Austin, still on stage, seemed oblivious to the growing distraction. He continued his presentation, clicking through slides that showed projected growth rates and market expansion plans. But his voice was beginning to compete with the increasing buzz of conversation as people read their messages and shared information with their neighbors. Marcus Webb, sitting in the journalist section, was the first to stand up. He was reading something on his phone, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock to what looked like professional excitement. He caught my eye across the auditorium and gave me the slightest nod before quietly making his way toward the exit. Board member Patricia Holbrook was next. She was reading something on her tablet, her face growing pale as she scrolled through what I knew must be hundreds of pages of documented evidence. She stood abruptly, whispered something to the person next to her, and headed for the door. Austin finally noticed the distraction. His confident presentation style faltered as he realized he was losing his audience. People were standing up, making phone calls, having urgent conversations in hushed tones. I think we might have some technical difficulties," Austin said, his smooth delivery cracking for the first time. "Perhaps we should take a short break to address whatever's causing this disruption." But it was too late. The exodus had begun. Investors were gathering their things and heading for the exits. Board members were making urgent phone calls. The journalists were practically running toward the doors, undoubtedly eager to begin verifying the information they'd just received. I stood up slowly, taking my time to gather my purse and jacket. Austin's eyes found mine across the rapidly emptying auditorium. His expression was no longer confident or predatory. It was confused, then concerned, then something approaching panic as he began to understand that his carefully orchestrated triumph was becoming a catastrophe. I walked toward the exit at a measured pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling. Other people rushed past me, their phones pressed to their ears, their voices urgent with the kind of conversations that happen when major news breaks. But I moved with the calm certainty of someone who'd planned every detail of this moment. Austin called out to me as I reached the door. "Maddie, Mrs. Pierce, what's happening? What's going on?" I paused at the threshold and looked back at him. He was still standing on the stage, still wearing that ridiculous color-shifting suit, but now he looked small and desperate, rather than commanding and confident. "Checkmate," I said quietly. the word barely audible above the chaos of the emptying auditorium. Then I walked out of Crestfall Innovations for the last time. The Portland autumn air was crisp and clean as I crossed the parking lot to my car. Behind me, the building that had been my professional home for 10 years was buzzing with activity. Through the windows, I could see people running through hallways, gathering in urgent clusters, making phone calls that would reshape the company's future. My phone was ringing constantly now. Reporters, investigators, former colleagues, all wanting to know what I knew about the allegations that were spreading across the internet like wildfire. I ignored them all. I'd said everything I needed to say in 200 pages of meticulously documented evidence. I drove home through the familiar streets of Portland, past the coffee shops and bookstores that had provided refuge during the difficult months of building my case. The city looked the same as it had that morning, but I knew that everything had changed. By evening, Austin Cade would be explaining himself to federal investigators. By tomorrow, Crestfall Innovations would be under scrutiny from every regulatory agency in the country. I parked in my driveway and sat in the car for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, unchanged by the corporate drama that had consumed my life for the past year. Kids were playing in front yards, dogs were barking in backyards, and somewhere, a lawnmower was running despite the late season. It was over. The fossil had fought back, and the fossil had won. Not through theatrical presentations or corporate buzzwords, but through patience, preparation, and the kind of methodical attention to detail that Austin had dismissed as old-fashioned thinking. I thought about the email that was still propagating across the internet, carrying its cargo of financial evidence to prosecutors and journalists who would spend the coming weeks unraveling the full extent of Austin's schemes. I thought about the investors who were probably already calculating their losses and planning their lawsuits. I thought about the board members who would have to explain to shareholders how they'd been fooled by a man in a neon suit and expensive sneakers. Most of all, I thought about the moment on stage when Austin had called me a fossil, when he'd turned my professional destruction into entertainment for an audience that had applauded his cruelty. He'd thought that humiliation was the end of the story, that once he'd publicly branded me as obsolete, I would simply fade away. But fossils, I reflected, have a way of preserving the truth. They endure long after the forces that tried to bury them have been forgotten. They provide evidence of what really happened, documented in layers of sediment that can't be altered by corporate spin or executive theater. Austin Cade had built his empire on a foundation of fraud and deception, held together by nothing more substantial than his ability to convince people that style was more important than substance. He'd forgotten that in the end, the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it. I got out of my car and walked toward my front door, leaving behind the corporate world that had defined my identity for so long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities. But tonight, I was content to be exactly what Austin had called me, a fossil, a keeper of evidence, a reminder that some truths are too important to remain buried. The rain began to fall again as I closed my front door behind me, the gentle Portland drizzle that washed the city clean and prepared it for whatever came next. Somewhere across town, Austin Cade was probably discovering that his carefully constructed empire was built on sand, and that the fossil he'd tried to discard had become the instrument of his downfall. The game was over. The fossil had won. And the truth, as it always does, had found a way to surface.